Summer of 2005, Chicago, Illinois. I woke in the emptiness of my apartment on the north side of the city, and for the first time in years, I felt a silence so complete that it carried neither comfort nor pain. Only the sharp clarity that my life had irrevocably changed. The morning light spilled across the hardwood floor in long pale stripes, illuminating the dust that had settled in corners I had once ignored. I looked at the photographs on the walls, images of people and places that had once been central to my world. And for the first time I saw them without the lens of habit or sentiment. Each frame, each object, each mark on the wall was tied to a past that no longer existed. The divorce with Allison had finalized a month ago. The paperwork was finished, the accounts settled, yet the weight of control lost lingered like a faint, persistent echo. I could feel the remnants of routines that had been broken, the invisible architecture of a life dismantled. I moved slowly through the apartment, touching surfaces, opening drawers, observing the items I had once collected without thought. Each book, each folder, each folded blueprint carried a memory, but also a question. What if this truly belonged to me, and what had been borrowed from a shared illusion? I began to gather documents, stacking old plans and sketches, sorting the remnants of my library. The process was meticulous, almost ritualistic, a way of imposing order on a world that had become chaotic. I assessed each item not for its sentimental value but for its relevance, its utility, its necessity in the reconstruction of a life that now had only one authority: myself. There was no anger, no longing, only the precise calculation of what could survive and what must be left behind. Walking through the apartment, I felt the absence of Allison in ways I had never acknowledged before. The spaces she had inhabited seemed larger, emptier, the echoes of her presence a contrast to the clarity I now possessed. I did not mourn, at least not in the way I had expected. Instead, I noted the void with the detached attention of someone examining a site before reconstruction. Every drawer emptied, every stack of papers reordered, every shelf reorganized became an act of reclamation. I was not rebuilding what had been, but constructing the framework of what could be. By mid-morning, the apartment began to feel different, not warmer, not filled with comfort, but stripped of unnecessary weight. I moved with purpose, cataloging, discarding, and arranging. The world outside remained unchanged, the city still buzzing, indifferent. Yet within these walls I was establishing a new law, one governed not by the past or by others, but solely by my own methodical reasoning. Emotions existed only as variables to consider, never as forces capable of dictating action. That day became the first step in the rational purification of my life. I understood, with a cold and unwavering clarity, that the chaos of the previous months had left a blank space in which I could operate without distraction or compromise. The cracks in my reflection, the fractures in the mirror of my life, were not wounds to lament but openings through which I could see the precise lines of the world I would rebuild. I moved through each task with measured attention, feeling neither regret nor longing, only the quiet, disciplined satisfaction of order slowly emerging from disorder. The past, I realized, had been a structure built on shared illusions. Its collapse was not a tragedy, but an opportunity to create something enduring, rational, and fully my own. I remained in the old house on the south side of Chicago, surrounded by objects that had once seemed to define the contours of our shared life. The walls held echoes of laughter, of arguments, of quiet mornings that had once seemed infinite, and now they felt accusatory, heavy with absence. Each room carried a memory I could not ignore, each piece of furniture a witness to choices that had seemed justified at the time but now appeared fragile, almost petty. The air itself seemed thick with the residue of what had been, pressing against me with a silent insistence that could not be avoided. I walked slowly through the living room, fingers brushing over surfaces, noting the way light fell across familiar shapes. There was a vase on the mantel that had always been ornamental, but now seemed almost ceremonial, marking the passage of decisions I could not undo. Books lined the shelves in perfect order, reminders of aspirations I had once clung to, symbols of ambition that had pulled me away from the foundation I had promised to protect. In the quiet, I realized that all the carefully constructed layers of independence, of external achievement, were fragile illusions. They had been a shield against fear, against vulnerability, but they had also built a distance impossible to bridge once the walls had risen too high. I moved to the bedroom, tracing the edges of the bed where we had lain together, feeling the emptiness of the space as a physical weight pressing down on me. The silence was not merely the absence of sound but a presence of consequence. A constant reminder that every decision I had made had ripple effects beyond my awareness at the time. The pursuit of career success, social recognition, personal autonomy. Each had seemed necessary, rational, even noble, yet they had been instruments of erosion. I understood, with a painful precision, that my desire to assert control over the external world had been inseparable from the neglect of the internal one. I opened drawers and cabinets, encountering the remnants of routines I had once valued. Photographs of vacations, letters tucked into envelopes, trinkets from holidays. They were all fragments of a narrative I had curated for the outside world, but ignored for the self and the marriage. Handling each item, I felt the illusions of power and authority dissolve. The house no longer seemed like a home, but a museum of decisions, a silent testimony to the consequences of choices made without full awareness. In the kitchen, I paused, looking at the dishes stacked neatly, a faint echo of domesticity that had always seemed mundane yet comforting. Now, the order felt brittle, fragile, as though any shift could collapse it entirely. I realized that the sense of control I had sought through meticulous management of tasks, appearances, and achievements had been a substitute for deeper engagement, for honest reckoning with vulnerability and partnership. The shadow of my own decisions loomed across the surfaces of the house, filling the space with quiet accusation. By the late afternoon, I understood that the emptiness was not something to be filled with distraction or superficial success. It was a void that demanded confrontation, reflection, and acceptance. The awareness of my errors was uncomfortable, even painful, but it was the first step toward a reckoning that had long been necessary. Each movement through the house, each touch of an object or photograph, was an acknowledgement of responsibility, an attempt to see clearly the ways in which my choices had shaped not only my life, but the life of another. The day closed with a stillness that was not relief but recognition. I felt the weight of consequence pressing against the chest of my existence. Yet within that pressure there was clarity. The illusions of control and mastery were gone, leaving in their place a sober understanding of the fragility of life built on self-interest. This confrontation with the shadow of my decisions was painful and isolating, yet it also carried a quiet necessity. Without it, there could be no growth, no possibility of reconstruction, only the continuation of patterns that had already brought destruction. In the absence of sound, in the presence of objects and memories, I began to comprehend the full scale of the work required, not to regain what was lost, but to learn, to recognize, and to move forward with deliberate, measured intention. I immersed myself in work as if it were the only anchor left in a world unsettled by absence and regret. The small office I had rented in the center of Chicago became a refuge and a laboratory at once, a place where order could emerge from the residue of past chaos. The space was minimalistic, stripped of unnecessary ornamentation, and every object was placed with deliberate intent. There were no distractions, no reminders of the life I had lost, only the clean surfaces of desks, the precision of tools, and the quiet hum of thought. Each project I undertook demanded meticulous attention. I studied measurements and materials with a patience that felt almost ritualistic, tracing lines on paper and imagining the structures they would form. I discovered nuances in design I had previously overlooked. The subtle interplay of light on concrete, the way shadows could define space as much as walls, the hidden geometry in angles and proportions. My work was no longer for the applause of others, no longer an attempt to carve a name into the world's memory. It was a private discipline, a rational construction of order in the midst of personal disarray. I arranged the office so that every element served a function. Books on architecture, engineering, and philosophy were stacked not for display but for immediate reference. Tools were aligned with care, each in its proper place. The walls were bare, allowing the mind to move freely, unencumbered by visual clutter. The minimalism was not an aesthetic choice alone but a psychological one, a declaration that every element of my environment would support intention rather than indulgence. In this space, the remnants of my previous life, photographs, souvenirs, the detritus of personal history, had no authority. They existed only in memory, and memory no longer dictated the shape of my present. Time became a measure of deliberate progress rather than a relentless river of obligations. Each completed drawing, each finalized blueprint, was a small victory, a tangible proof that creation was possible through patient, methodical effort. I began to understand that the essence of power lay not in spectacle or recognition, but in consistency, in the disciplined accumulation of deliberate acts. Even the simplest decisions, how a line was drawn, how a surface was treated, how a room was oriented, carried weight. The careful sequencing of these choices formed a rhythm I could rely upon, a rhythm that insulated me from the turbulence of past mistakes. I noticed the change in myself as the months passed. The restless anxiety that had once gnawed at my consciousness receded, replaced by a quiet, watchful clarity. I no longer sought external approval or validation. My satisfaction came from the integrity of the work itself, from the alignment between thought, intention, and execution. Projects that might have previously seemed mundane or repetitive became exercises in precision and comprehension. The structures I designed were not monuments to ambition but frameworks of rationality, spaces where functionality, balance, and clarity coexisted. Evenings were spent reviewing progress, annotating sketches, and refining concepts. I observed patterns in my own methods, noting tendencies toward excess or omission, and I corrected them with patient rigor. The act of creation became meditative, each decision reinforcing a sense of control and composure that had been absent in years past. I began to feel that I was not merely constructing buildings, but reconstructing the internal architecture of my mind, realigning priorities, restoring the foundations of patience, focus, and deliberate thought. In this way, the past slowly lost its power over me. The failures, regrets, and disruptions no longer dictated the contours of my days. Each completed project was a milestone not only of skill but of psychological reclamation. The office, the sketches, the buildings that began to rise under my direction were all markers of a new reality I was constructing with deliberate intention. I realized that true accomplishment was quiet, almost invisible, yet it carried with it a strength that spectacle could never provide. I had begun to build a world that was resilient, measured, and self-contained. A world in which I could exist without dependence on the fleeting judgments of others. A world where the architecture of order extended beyond concrete and steel into the very structure of my own life. By the time night fell over the city, I often remained alone in the office, the streets outside lit with scattered neon, the hum of the city distant yet present. In those moments, I sensed a continuity that had been absent in my previous existence. The new world I was building was quiet, rational, and unyielding to caprice, and in it, I found a measure of calm I had long considered unattainable. My past no longer held dominion. It existed as a reference, a lesson, a shadow against which the clarity of the present shone all the brighter. Each day reinforced the realization that life could be reconstructed, reshaped, and disciplined. And in that construction lay a quiet, almost imperceptible victory that no external recognition could rival. In 2008, I walked into the expansive hall of a Chicago architectural exhibition, a space filled with polished floors, stark lighting, and the quiet hum of conversations layered over the subtle echo of footsteps. The event was a convergence of creators, investors, and sponsors, a place where prestige and ambition were displayed as carefully as the buildings themselves. I moved through the hall with deliberate steps, observing the structures on display with the analytical eye I had cultivated, measuring proportion, evaluating form, noting the precision or carelessness in design. My presence was intentional, controlled, each movement aligned with the rational order I had imposed on my life. I did not expect to see her there. I had not anticipated that the currents of this city, the circuits of chance and coincidence, would place her in my path. She appeared as part of a group representing a series of sponsored projects, their successes public and loudly affirmed. I recognized her immediately, not because of memory alone, but because of the subtle ways she carried herself, a combination of awareness and hesitation that betrayed an effort to measure the impact of my presence. She sought acknowledgement, a spark of connection, but I met her with quiet immobility, a rational barrier formed from years of self-discipline, and the deliberate construction of emotional detachment. She approached, or perhaps the flow of the exhibition drew us into proximity, and I felt the familiar tension of past familiarity reframed through the lens of time. Her gaze, searching and urgent, attempted to decipher my emotions, to elicit a response that might reopen doors long closed. I remained still, observing without yielding, aware of the history between us yet untouched by its lingering echoes. There was no anger, no longing, no indulgence in sentimentality. I felt only the clarity of presence, a rational awareness of what existed and what had been deliberately left behind. She became visible not as a companion of the past, but as a reflection of choices, illusions, and misunderstandings she had carried for years. I saw in her posture the tension between ambition and regret, the subtle fragility beneath the exterior of control she had cultivated. The power she sought to reclaim in my attention was ephemeral against the structure I had built within myself. I understood the unspoken reckoning she faced, that the illusions which had once defined her life held no influence over me, that the quiet mastery of my own decisions and the disciplined clarity I had imposed upon my days could not be unsettled by pleas or nostalgia. The exhibition continued around us, the chatter of patrons and the soft glow of display lights forming a backdrop, almost irrelevant to the encounter. Every movement I made was intentional, every glance measured. I noted how she shifted, how her confidence faltered in the presence of the order I projected, how the walls she had built around herself now seemed inadequate when faced with the solidity of mine. I recognized the subtle surrender in her posture, a recognition that some forces could not be negotiated with, that authority of a certain kind, internal, rational, disciplined, was impervious to charm, regret, or regretful longing. I walked past her then, not with haste, but with the calm precision of one unencumbered by unresolved attachments. I carried with me the quiet weight of continuity, the knowledge that my life, structured and deliberate, would remain unaffected by attempts to reclaim what had been intentionally left behind. The encounter left no chaos in me, only a reaffirmation of the principles I had followed. Clarity over sentiment, order over indulgence, self-mastery over external manipulation. She lingered in the periphery of my awareness, a symbol of lessons learned and illusions dispelled, and as I moved deeper into the hall, her presence became a marker of the boundary between past and present, between influence that could shape me and influence that had long since lost its power. The exhibition ended, the crowd dispersed, but the clarity of the encounter remained. I felt the cold satisfaction of comprehension, the almost imperceptible satisfaction of recognizing the permanence of inner order against transient ambition. In that moment, I understood fully that life was not a matter of reclamation or revenge, of rekindling old emotions or reconciling past failures. It was a matter of careful construction, the deliberate arrangement of thought and action, the disciplined shaping of a world in which chaos could be observed, but never allowed to dominate. The intersection at which we met had been a convergence of choice and consequence, and I walked away knowing that my trajectory, defined by rational control and measured creation, remained intact and unassailable. I became aware of her presence in the periphery of my professional life long before she spoke of it aloud. She had begun examining my projects, attending exhibitions, reviewing portfolios, tracing the lines and measurements I had so carefully constructed over years of deliberate effort. I watched as she leaned over plans, fingers hovering over the precise grids and annotations that dictated the function and flow of space, her gaze flicking from one schematic to another with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Every drawing she observed was a testament to methodical attention, to an insistence on coherence that could not be faked or hurried. I sensed the subtle tremor of realization in her posture, a quiet recognition that what she had once dismissed as mundane or overly meticulous was, in fact, the architecture of enduring strength. I felt no triumph in her confusion or discomfort, only the steady awareness that her perceptions were shifting. Her world, which had been organized around image, spectacle, and immediate reward, could not comprehend the slow accumulation of deliberate thought, the layering of consequence and foresight that defined my work. She encountered the systems I had designed, the invisible infrastructure that enabled functionality to exist alongside beauty, and the cognitive dissonance it produced was palpable. I saw her pause over the intricacies of a building's ventilation, over the way light had been choreographed to follow daily cycles, over the careful sequencing of structural supports. She was confronted with the truth that excellence was invisible to those unwilling to observe, that mastery required patience and discipline far beyond charm or superficial effort. Her own choices, I could sense, were suddenly reframed against the rigor of mine. The career she had built, the social networks she had navigated, the moments she had counted as success, all of it seemed suddenly thin, ephemeral, lacking the solidity that only long-term vision could provide. I perceived in her a momentary collapse, not of her identity, but of the illusion she had carried, the myths she had told herself about power, freedom, and control. Each page she turned, each measurement she traced, was a confrontation with her own superficiality. The veneer of competence she had relied upon, once sufficient to maintain her confidence, was dissolving under the weight of rigor and precision. I did not intervene. I allowed her to witness the depth of my work, to experience the quiet potency of my discipline without commentary or interference. I understood that the most effective form of revelation was observation unaccompanied by judgment. I could feel her internal dissonance, the subtle tension of someone realizing that their previous strategies, their methods of influence and persuasion, were inadequate to penetrate the fortress of deliberate effort I had constructed. There was no anger in this awareness, only the bitter clarity of recognition. She had pursued illusions of control and brilliance, yet the true power lay in the care and foresight she had neglected, in the patience to see structures through from conception to enduring completion. In the solitude of my office, I reflected on her experience as though it were a mirror held up to past mistakes, a silent validation of the discipline I had cultivated. I had no desire to humiliate, no need to assert dominance. The confrontation existed entirely within the realm of truth. She would encounter the limits of her understanding, the boundaries of superficial achievement, and the painful yet illuminating recognition that admiration and recognition could never substitute for mastery. The process was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly destabilizing. By the time she left my portfolio, the tension in her posture had altered, a subtle weight pressing down on the space around her, a withdrawal from certainty that was both visible and invisible. I observed the collapse of her self-image without satisfaction, only with awareness, noting the stark contrast between transient appearances and the enduring force of considered effort. I recognized that the lesson she was receiving could not be undone, that the illusion she had clung to had been dismantled not by argument or confrontation, but by exposure to something beyond superficial comprehension. In that encounter, I felt the quiet power of what I had built within myself, the accumulation of years of disciplined thought, the cultivation of patience and insight, the insistence on substance over spectacle. The shattering of her image was neither vengeance nor performance. It was simply the natural consequence of her presence in a space governed by rigor, an unspoken testament to the reality that true strength resided in depth, preparation, and care, and that superficial brilliance, however dazzling, could never endure against such a foundation. By 2012, I had completed the central architectural complex I had envisioned years earlier, a structure that embodied the clarity, precision, and intentionality I had cultivated in myself. Every line, every volume, every functional decision had been carefully considered, and in its completion, I recognized a silent testament to the disciplined accumulation of effort over time. The complex stood not as a monument to vanity, but as a demonstration of reasoned vision made tangible. Walking through its corridors, observing how light fell across the open atriums and how spaces guided movement without overt direction, I felt a quiet affirmation. This was the result of persistent, deliberate labor, unaffected by fleeting emotion or external expectation. I had also established a foundation to support emerging architects and initiatives that I believed carried genuine promise. I structured it with the same rigor I applied to my work, insisting on clear evaluation, long-term sustainability, and measurable impact. Each project I funded was a small act of extension, a way to propagate careful thought, to encourage those willing to build with patience and foresight. I observed the network of young professionals I had influenced, noting how ideas spread, how discipline and vision, when cultivated, could ripple outward. I took no pride in public acknowledgement. The satisfaction was internal. The quiet knowledge that effort invested wisely had multiplied its effect beyond immediate perception. My past existed only as a faint echo, a whisper of lessons learned and mistakes endured. The bitterness of loss, the disorientation of failed personal relationships, the moments of regret, each had left traces, but none dictated the present. I had separated memory from action, allowing reflection without surrender, acknowledging the past without granting it authority. In this clarity, I found freedom. Freedom to construct, to cultivate, to act in accordance with principles that were tested and durable. She remained at the edges of this world, present in awareness but absent in influence. I recognized the subtle tension her observation carried, a recognition without the power to intervene, a measure of presence rendered ineffective by my sustained discipline. I felt no satisfaction in this fact beyond the rational acknowledgement of consequence, that those who relied on appearances and superficial control would never penetrate the structures built on careful thought. The lesson had been imparted quietly, irrevocably, without spectacle, yet its impact was absolute. In my life, there was nothing superfluous. Every object, every decision, every commitment had been weighed against principle and purpose. I moved forward with deliberate steps, guided by long-term objectives, rather than immediate gratification, aware that true stability derived not from loud assertion, but from consistent action. I understood now that strength was measured not in confrontation or recognition, but in the ability to sustain creation, to act without need for approval, and to preserve the integrity of process, even when unseen by others. The conclusion of this chapter of my life brought no dramatic confrontation, no climactic upheaval. The victory was subtle, internal, and enduring. It was the triumph of reason over illusion, of disciplined vision over chaotic impulse, of sustained effort over transient desire. I had not needed to prove anything aloud. The world itself became the measure of what I had accomplished. In the quiet of my office, in the resonance of completed projects, in the enduring presence of the foundation I had built, I felt the affirmation of a life directed by principle, clarity, and deliberate purpose.